and welcome to Mending the Gender Pay Gap, where we will be discussing the recent independent review on the gender pay gap in medicine, known as the Dacre report, and focusing on what this means for general practice. I'm Victoria Tzortziou-Brown, and I'm the Joint Honorary Secretary at the Royal College of GPs. We currently have a live poll on Twitter where you can vote on the upcoming questions, and the link to vote is being put in the chat now. And also you can put your questions to our panel by using the hashtag RCGPWomen on social media, or comment below the feed if you're watching directly on YouTube. The video will be captioned and a full transcript made available after the live event. It's over 150 years now since Elizabeth Garrett became the first English woman to qualify as a doctor. And I will read to you a little bit about the history of Elizabeth Garrett. So she joined as a nursing student at Middlesex Hospital and attended classes intended for male doctors, but was barred after complaints from other students. As the Society of Apothecaries did not specifically forbid women from taking their examinations, in 1865 she passed their exams and gained a certificate which enabled her to become a doctor. The society then changed its rules to prevent other women entering the profession this way. So we have come a long way since then, and in the last 25 years, more women than men have entered medical school. And today, more than 50% of our GPs within general practice are women. However, there remains a significant gender pay gap, both in general practice and in medicine more widely. In December 2020, the groundbreaking independent review into this gender pay gap was published. And today I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel to look at the implications of this review for general practice and answer some of your questions on what the next steps might look like. To tell us more on this report, I'm honored to have with us the chair of the report, Dame Professor Jane Dacre. Jane.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening. So the report had a long gestation. The idea of gender pay gaps and gender pay gap reporting being mandatory was first started off during the time of Theresa May. Remember her, poor lady. This was one really good thing that she did, was make gender pay gap reporting mandatory for organisations with more than 250 employees. Of course, the NHS is one of those. So I was commissioned by the then Secretary of State, Jeremy Hunt, to look at the gender pay gap review and to lead the report. And if you remember, this was back around the time of the Junior Doctors Industrial Action in 2016. So gender pay gap reporting had been talked about within the government, but during the Junior Doctors Industrial Action, Jeremy Hunt and I were sparring on a regular basis and crossing swords with each other. And one of the issues that came to light is that the imposition of the junior doctor contract might actually increase the gender pay gap for junior doctors. And this caused a huge hoo-ha, quite rightly, I think, at the time. And so what Jeremy did was undertake to do a gender pay gap review. So a couple of years later, he and I were getting on probably a little bit better. We were doing some work on patient safety together. And he asked me if I would lead it because he knew that I had a long-standing interest in gender in relation to medicine. So we started working together. And I think one of the best things that we did in all of that was appoint Carol Woodhams, who you're going to hear from later, as the lead researcher. So Carol and I set up working on this with a steering group. The work went on between between 2018 and 2020. It took longer to publish than we thought because we had various different things, if you remember. And more recently, the two latest things that slowed it down were, of course, Brexit and COVID. So the report had a very, very long birth. And then when it came out, it had less of a splash than we'd hoped it would, because it came out during the middle of the winter wave of COVID. So that's how it all got started. But what we had done for the report is have access to tremendous data sets, and Carol and her team did fantastic work looking through these data sets, and we were able to do collate data sets from a huge number of doctors, including a huge number of GPs, more than 100,000 doctors. And these were all put together, and they were put together with some qualitative work, some work in looking at the literature and the policy literature, a survey, an independent survey of a group of doctors, and an in-depth survey, and also all of the numbers that we got from NHS Digital. So a huge amount of work went into getting those data sets together. And this was actually the biggest review of its kind, we think, ever in the world, partly because the NHS is such a massive employer, and partly because we have one health system, so we're able to look at things in a big way in the NHS. So it's a real example of where the NHS comes into its own. So, well, what did we find? Well, we're going to be talking about it during the course of the review, but in a nutshell, there are pay gaps everywhere in medicine. They are big for a single specialty group. And if you divide the specialties down, GPs, if you look at the raw pay gap, do quite badly. The raw pay gap for general practice is 33.5%, which is huge. But when we look at the data sets, a lot of that is because of part-time working. So we're going to be talking about the pay gaps and a bit more about it later on. So I'm going to just leave those slightly scary numbers with you and say, well, okay, why? Why are these big pay gaps? And the answers are kind of not rocket science, but need to be addressed. So age is a big issue. Men are older in the workforce. Men are more senior. Men go into specialties where they're paid more. Men take up jobs where they're paid more. And there are a whole number of issues like that I think may come up in the rest of the report. We came up with 7 themes and 42 recommendations about what to do. And I'm pleased to say that actually just earlier today, we've agreed to move forward with an implementation plan. So that's just a taster for you. We'll go into the detail of a lot of the other stuff should people ask about it during the course of the evening. But I think probably that's enough of an overview for now. So thank you very much, Victoria.
Thank you, Jane, for this introduction. And the first question on our live Twitter poll, we have asked if people know what the mean gender pay gap is. And currently, 50% of our respondents think it is 7.7%, and 50% of our respondents think it is 33.5%. So quite a big gap between the two. So before we go much further, let's break down some definitions with Professor Carol Woodhams. Carol.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you, Jane, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share what we know about gender pay gaps in general practice with you today. So we should start off with a definition, really, which might be the cause of that disparity of understandings in terms of what is the gender pay gap. To define, it is the difference in a mean salary between men and women expressed as a percentage of men's salary. So it is the difference between men and women expressed as a percentage of the hire, which is usually men. But of course, this is just the starting point, and it raises more questions than it answers. The gender pay gap is one of those issues that is highly debated in society, and the causes of it are quite complex. So from this point, what we do is we undertake what we call adjustment. So we start to account for factor after factor that might explain the gender pay gap. The starting point, we take our guidance here from the ONS, and we use prorated salary. That is salaries that are extrapolated to be equivalent to full-time hours. So we take out the kind of the part-time element. It makes it kind of a little bit of a falsehood because you're comparing salaries across some people that simply don't work full-time. But in order to create equivalence between men and women, we extrapolate to a full-time salary as a measure of the gap. However, of course, there are still more questions. So what are the factors that explain it other than hours? You know, what else could it be caused? Could it be caused by? So here we think of things like, as Jane mentioned, different roles within general practice, different measures of experience. There may be geographic factors that play here. And what we need to get to the point, in an ideal world, that those factors that are predictable, those factors that in some way justify different levels of pay would explain 100% of the pay gap. So we would be able to clarify it, see it, talk about it, measure it, reduce it. And this is how it's different from unequal pay. So where you can explain a pay gap, that removes it from unequal pay. Unequal pay is the different rates of pay for the same job. But where you can explain differences in work, differences in jobs, that creates pay gaps. So that's the difference between unequal pay and pay gaps. So I think we should apply this to GPs. So first of all, we needed the data, and it's important given that individual circumstances are different, and these make an individual difference to pay, and therefore an individual gender pay gap. We need to capture as many of these factors about individuals as we can. So our data was obtained from linking two sources. The HMRC for pay gave us pay data, and data from each GP practice uploaded to a national database gives details of workforce. So this is personal profiles, including gender, hours, age, etc. These two data sets were linked via doctor's national insurance number. I should make it clear right now that we didn't see this data. It wasn't passed over to us. We wrote the code and the analysis was done for us. And they sent back, HMRC did the analysis and sent back the outcomes. So what were those outcomes? So I should point out to you, there's a slide appeared on the screen, that there are pay gaps, as Jane says, everywhere. And these pay gaps exist within the ranks of salaried and within the ranks of partner or contractor GPs. So I can also take questions later on, perhaps on comparisons with other roles through a medical career. And what can we learn? What did we learn during the review about what explains these patterns? As Jane touched on there, we can find that men and women are very unequally allocated through the ranks of partnership. If women were equally allocated throughout partnerships, the gender pay gap would reduce straight away by about 30% overall, by about 60% even of what we can discern or what we know. And that is 30% of the GP pay gap overall. Age is also important, experience is important. And once women catch up with men in terms of the experience that they have, again, the gender pay gap will shrink. Geographic regional differences were not particularly important, but the most outstanding feature from our point of view of this analysis was the size of the portion that is not explained by the factors in the equation. The extent of the pay gap that is not explained, in other words, by hours of work, role, seniority, age, geographic region for GPs is considerable. In the hospital and trust sector, we were able to capture and explain using the same factors 99.5% of variance, gender variance in pay. We could explain it, it's predictable. GP pay is not predictable. There is a large proportion that we cannot capture using the same factors. It's larger than expected, it's larger than for trust doctors, and I would say that, and we expressed in the review, that it's quite a cause for concern. There are potential explanations that can be offered for these, but I shall leave it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Really interesting. And let's go now to Samira and hear the BMA perspective.
Thank you very much for inviting me on behalf of the BMA and GPC to speak on such an important subject. What I'll start with is just going through an overview of what the BMA generally in terms of priorities, and then drilling down to GP specific issues. So in terms of priorities, salary and additional payments. So for example, tackling discrimination and unfairness in the CA scheme, supporting doctors in the local negotiations, and looking at other pay gaps and understanding how gender intersects with other characteristics such as ethnicity and disability, because we know intersectionality does play a really important role. Retention and flexible career pathways. So our careers start quite young, and as we've heard, as we get older and more experienced, the gender pay gap narrows. So structural changes to medical training to enable more doctors to complete their training, supporting policies to improve retention such as the GP retention scheme. This is very important in GP because we have a huge exodus of female GPs in their 30s, which coincides with when many of them choose to have children. Accessing senior positions, so senior posts to be available for doctors who work flexibly, whether that's as a partner or whether that's a leader in your CCG role, or and greater visibility of women in senior roles, so role modelling. Support for doctors experiencing the menopause. We did a menopause survey which showed that there was a huge lack of awareness and support. And if you think about the very experienced women that undergo these issues, it's really important that actually there are adjustments and an awareness made to enable these women to perform their job to the best of their ability and also stay within the workforce. And more support for doctors who have children. We also know about carers, so people may have elderly parents or other dependents. So looking at extending enhanced pay for shared parental leave to all doctors, calling for more accessible and affordable childcare, and improving support around pregnancy and maternity leave. In terms of culture, tackling sexism and sexist attitudes is a huge priority. We did a sexism in medicine survey, and the majority of respondents felt that sexism was a barrier to career progression. In fact, 1/5 of people that responded felt their progression had been significantly impacted by gender. Tackling bullying and harassment, and as mentioned previously, intersectionality, looking at intersectional discrimination at work. GP specific issues, so the GP contract agreement from 2021 to 2023 secured commitments that could narrow the gender pay gap. For example, looking at the minimum sickness and parental leave provisions for all staff in primary care and what they should be able to expect, childcare support, occupational health provision, so that this is aligned to wider NHS England and NHS improvement work and tackling the gender pay gap in general practice as a whole. An agreement to work towards greater transparency of the gender pay gap in general practice. We're currently exploring how we could do this. As mentioned previously, part of the difficulty is accessing the data, and this is even more important when looking to see any interventions and the outcome that they would have. We need to be able to have that information and compare. More recently, the sessional committee have worked really hard to succeed in a generous offer of enhanced shared parental leave. GPC England have agreed to include this in the model salary GP contract and partnership agreements, and we'll be developing guidance on this. Key pieces of work outside of GP, as just so that people are aware: guidance for work consultants working flexibly part-time, disability in medicine profession report, challenging the cultural menopause, BMA guidance on working less than full-time, guidance on job planning, and we've had several webinars on negotiation skills. Thank you.
Thank you, Samira. And the report also looked into the gender pay gap within academia. So now I will bring Caroline to tell us a little bit, bring her perspective as a GP academic.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for inviting me onto this panel. I'm a GP, I'm an academic at Keele University, and I'm chair of the Society for Academic Primary Care. As a GP principal, in my practice, we strive to ensure that we offer the same terms and conditions of service to all clinicians, whatever their gender, and we feel that we support staff and offer flexibility to those with caring responsibilities. As an academic, I've mostly worked full-time. I did try to reduce my hours when my daughter was young, but I failed miserably. I was not able to restrict academic time to the time that I was scheduled and paid for. And I think this is something that affects all academics with caring responsibilities who try and work part-time, but it particularly affects women. I'd like to highlight two areas where I think it's attitude to women that has impacted on my academic role and impacts broadly and results in a gender pay gap. I was aware that a male colleague was paid more than myself when we were at the same level, and he'd negotiated that. And I think women have difficulty having those negotiations. We have difficulty blowing our own trumpets. I also struggled for 2 years when essentially I was a single mother. My husband worked abroad, and I couldn't seem to explain and be understood why I couldn't make an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting, or I wasn't able to stay overnight at conferences. You know, I was expected to do that, and there was no understanding at all. And I think this is why women drop out of academia. Lastly, I want to mention Clinical Excellence Awards. These are available to senior academic GPs who are classed as consultants. Senior academic GPs are approximately 50% female, 50% male. But actually the split of Clinical Excellence Awards is 80% male and 20% female. So why is that? Is it because women are less likely to apply? Is it that their applications are judged less favourably? We don't know. But again, I think it's back to this: women are not very good at saying how good they are at blowing their own trumpet. So the Society for Academic Primary Care is asked to give citations and rank applications, and we have a mentoring scheme. So I'm just saying to budding academics out there, please join us, please seek a mentor and seek help if you want support to apply for a Clinical Excellence Award.
Brilliant, thank you, Caroline. I will bring Amanda now for her reflections on the conversation so far and what this gender pay gap means for GPs.
Thank you. I'm almost at the end of my career. I've been a GP for nearly 40 years, and I've seen a huge change in both the scope of general practice as a specialty and the ways that people can work as a GP. And I really welcome the opportunities that women have had to have a great career in general practice. You know, I really am glad I did this job, but I was really sad to see the results of Carol and Jane's reports, because, you know, the diversity and flexibility that GP can offer as a career still seems to be resulting in unequal rewards for people. So as we've been told, you know, even if you adjust for the age and stage of career and the roles played and the hours worked and different types of contract, women still seem to risk getting paid less for their work and get less rewards in terms of career progression and opportunities. So I think we've really got to learn from this. I did do some research with some other colleagues about what was enabling women to maximise their work in general practice. And that reflected some of the report's findings. We still see that on the whole, in many cultures, women still shoulder the double burden of caring. So looking after dependents at home and juggling work against that. And so unless they can find, or we can find, positive and supportive working environments that allow us to do both at some points in our lives, it's not usually the whole career, they seem to either risk loss of income, loss of career opportunities, and sometimes even end up leaving because they just can't find the right way to juggle, which we can't afford if people are good and they're committed and we've spent a lot of money and time training, and we don't want to lose them from the profession. And then the other thing that made a difference was workplace culture. And part of that was, are people getting rewarded equally for hours worked and responsibilities taken? And if they feel that, of course, they feel valued and they thrive. And, you know, hopefully, even with the workload challenges, they're remaining enthusiastic GPs. Whereas people who, you know, are always being told, oh, you women always want to work part-time and, you know, why don't you take more responsibility? That's denigratory. And that means that, you know, staff leave and go to other places to work. So I was fascinated by Carol's statement about, you know, we still can't explain a lot of this. And hopefully in the next phase of implementation, we can really help to unpick where it's going. But I think the college has three ways to help. And in a way, for our members, these are probably our usual mechanisms. You know, we educate, we advocate, and we collaborate. So this webinar is about raising awareness and educating members more about some of the evidence and the current issues. I'm sure we'll be wanting to advocate to close the gender pay gap at all relevant levels and support members to be asking the right questions and to make sure that there's more transparency as they negotiate. And of course, we'll collaborate with our members and our key partners, such as the GPC and SAPC and other colleges, to find out what really needs to change and how to achieve that.
Thank you very much. And now turning to the last member of our panel, we know that the report on gender pay gap has clearly shown that the pay gap increases with increasing age and as careers progress. However, the assumptions and the judgments that play into this probably begin in training or even before then. So Davina, what's your experience in your career so far?
Thank you, Victoria, for inviting me onto this panel. So I'm the GP trainee and the junior doctor representative on the Medical Women's Federation Council. So yes, like you said, interestingly, there's no gender pay gap at the start of doctors' careers, and it tends to emerge at specialty training stage or when doctors are around the age of 30. This is basically a grade in age when many start to have children. And data from universities and colleges have shown that women have outnumbered men at medical school entry for the last 25 years. Now, there are many challenges and issues that arise during the early years of medical training. I remember thinking about what choice of speciality, having a family, continuing with medical training, and even some people are thinking about less than full-time training. But despite comprising the majority of the UK's health and social care workforce, women still remain significantly underrepresented in senior medical grades, on NHS boards, and in leadership and senior management positions across the NHS. Now, how do you think female trainees feel about this? Are these positions not for us? Are they out of our reach? Is this the exemplar image that we actually want to portray to young female doctors? Well, women seem to remain these victims of pay discrimination that emerges in large part from a perpetuation of the premise that family and childcare are primarily their responsibilities rather than shared with men. And this is shocking, as gender-based assumptions have no place in the 21st century workforce, and something we should not have to deal with as female trainees. As Jane mentioned earlier, I still remember following the junior doctor contract negotiations in 2016, and it was noted that the new NHS contract for doctors and dentists in training has a potentially negative impact on the pay gap due to a loss of increments during maternity leave. And now, as expected, the review has found that women doctors face disproportionate career and financial costs from having children compared to their male counterparts. Now, we need to highlight there's interventions that we need to do that are career stage and age specific. And we need to have these supporting initiatives starting from medical school, going through these academic institutions, trusts, and local organisations. With representatives at the Medical Women's Federation, I conducted an online qualitative survey exploring the current areas of concern for women in medicine. And the survey was completed by women from ages of 18 to 69, professional grades from medical students to consultants, and across 24 different specialities. And what we found was that 5 key themes about what bothered women during a career in medicine was mentorship and support, flexibility relating to maternity leave and childcare, differential treatment in the workplace, gender pay gap, and intersectionality. Now, we found that medical students frequently mention issues around differential treatment, references to sexism, harassment, and gender bias. Foundation doctors and registrars cited maternity and childcare issues as problems, and consultants cited childcare issues as well as the gender pay gap. And there were problems with leave, childcare provision, part-time training, pressures of maintaining a work-family balance, and also maternity identity. So we must recognise that all these themes are not mutually exclusive, and we need to move beyond single-factor interventions and work in a more complex, multifactorial, contextual way to improve these institutional environments and support women across all stages of their medical career. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Great initial thoughts and introductions. One of the key recommendations of the report was this around flexible working. So we put the question on Twitter. We asked, how important is flexible working for you to balance your professional and home life? And are you concerned about it affecting your pay? And the answers that we got, 20% of our respondents said it is important and I'm worried, and 80% responded it is important and it did affect me. So this is really interesting. 80% of our respondents said that they had personal experience that these flexible working opportunities have affected them. So according to a parliamentary report, only 6% of well-paid jobs are advertised as open to flexible working. And this contributes to the gender pay gap by limiting women's options and also hampers productivity. So the report went on to recommend that flexible working is not just about part-time working, which, by the way, can perpetuate the pay gap, but should include working remotely. And we have all experienced the benefits of remote working, especially during the pandemic, but also job sharing with examples and case studies on good practice. And there are increasingly more examples of successful job sharing at, for example, chief executive level. However, this is still by no means the norm, and it seems to be that a change in culture is really required. So I'm curious to hear a bit more from our panel, both on flexible working in general and also on job sharing for highly influential positions. So if we come to Jane and Carol first to speak on their findings from their review in regards to this recommendation.
So flexible working is really interesting, and the results of your survey suggest that, I don't know whether everybody in the audience is female, but it suggests that the vast majority of the audience are keen on flexible working. And what the findings in the review have shown is that in order to get flexibility, women take a pay penalty. And that's the bit that doesn't work for me. Because women should not have to take a pay penalty to have flexibility to look after their families. And so in the review, what we suggested that if we could change the culture so that everybody might want to work flexibly, then you may be able to reduce the pay gap, because there wasn't that expectation of presenteeism, which is easier to do if you're a man and you have no caring responsibilities. So on a personal level, when I had 2 children under the age of 3, I did a job share. I shared my job with a guy called Tim, actually Tim Spector of the Zoe app, if anybody has heard of him. Tim and I shared this job, and I did a job share with Tim so that I could go to the shops on Friday and get the food for my family. He did a job share with me so that he could do research and advance his career. And that's what happens with flexible working. Women sacrifice their career progression in order to do their domestic commitments. But actually, if we had real equality, we would both be taking time off to go shopping, and we would both be working on our career. And one of the best quotes I've ever heard in career guidance came from my friend Tim, when he sat me down and he said, "Jane, in your career, it's time you became a full-time skiver rather than a part-time martyr. If you want to go to the shops, you go to the shops. Just don't worry about it. Just do what you need to do, and don't keep sacrificing your career progression at the altar of flexibility." So I suppose that's where I would start.
Brilliant, thank you. And Carol?
Yes, thank you. So flexibility really is a double-edged sword, because it is convenient, it helps us to make sense of our working lives. However, it comes with quite a considerable penalty because for each hour that you're working flexibly, or and I'm talking here time rather than location, for each hour that you've lost that experience, and that accumulates over career to lead to a diminishing human capital, a diminishing sense of value. But worse than that, actually, it's about other people's perceptions of you. And therefore, you're not put forward for opportunities, and you're not put forward for experiences. So your penalty, particularly in medicine, is disproportionate to the lost hours. We're currently doing some work on promotion to consultant, and it shows that over career, if you take away all of the hours lost over a career, all of the hours spent working part-time, those accumulated missing hours that women tend to take more of than men, that doesn't account for the difference between men and women in their differential promotion to consultant. It doesn't account for all of it. So it's actually much more around the opportunities lost, the experience lost, and the perception of other people. And medicine seems to be quite a punishing career choice for those who want to work flexibly.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, one of the things we also mentioned in the recommendations of the review is that people ought to be rewarded for the competence that they've acquired rather than the time that they've served. And in curricula and the way curricula are developed in medicine, there is often a time served component. And the time served component, in order for women who work part-time to make it up, they end up being on training pathways with lower salaries for very long periods of time. But women who have children, who manage a life, who manage caring, who manage their careers as well, accrue a set of competencies that are not recognised and not measured. So we ought to be looking at their team working ability rather than which they've developed by, I don't know, sharing the school run with somebody, as well as the time that they've served, and we don't do that. So looking at the acquisition of competency rather than time served is one of the recommendations that we've made.
Well said, Jane, thank you. Caroline, your perspective from the academic world, please.
Thanks, Victoria. Well, flexibility, which you might want to try and get through working part-time, is really difficult. It's a really difficult juggling act for clinical academics. So academics are judged on their ability to attract research funding, publish papers in high-quality journals, implement their research findings, and achieve impact from their work. And when an academic works part-time, their progress and their success may be overlooked when their CV is being judged. The fact they've worked part-time is often forgotten. So for example, a clinical academic working, say, a full day in practice and 4 days academic time may publish 8 papers in 2 years, but a female working a day clinically and 2 days in research may publish 5 or 6 papers, but actually be judged to be underperforming because in that same 2 years they're seen to publish less papers, and it's forgotten that they've worked part-time. And as Jane and Carol said, working flexibly, part-time, job sharing as a clinical academic is punishing.
Thank you. Samira, it would be interesting to hear from you regarding your work on the inclusion of flexible working in the NHS People Plan and what this can mean for trainees, please.
Thank you. So I just wanted to share a couple of personal reflection, if that's okay, please. When I started as a GP trainee about 10 years ago, one of my colleagues who was male applied to work less than full time because he wanted to do so for childcare. And he was told by the training programme director that he didn't need to and that his wife should instead, which is really interesting because then you have a system perpetuating these cultural and sexist. And I remember he was completely outraged, which was very reassuring for me. But I think it shows you that there are really really entrenched barriers. And I remember when I was working less than full time and I was doing my BMA roles as a trainee, I always made sure I got the ARCP requirements that a full-time trainee got, because I did not want anyone turning around and saying to me, Samira, I'm sorry, you're slacking a bit because you're working 50% or whatever percentage and you're not doing, and I think you need to cut down on your extracurricular leadership roles, which often happens. So I think there is pressure, and it's about equity, it's about degendering this, it's about it's everyone's issue, and it's about having that accessibility so there isn't that stigma attached. Specifically onto VMA issues, I think this is the flexible working is a really important issue. It's in the NHS People Plan. The NHS is now being held up as a sort of lead example of how to incorporate flexible working, how to be a good employer, how to retain people. Some of the challenges around flexible working is the definition, as we've touched upon. What is flexible working? How would it work? Does it mean that you could potentially be on a 0 hours contract and your employer tells you turn up? You know, that there are pros and cons, and I think we really need to sort of pin down what does it mean, how would it work, and what the evidence is, and look at the systematic barriers. So, for example, designing medical careers, favouring doctors who work longer hours without breaks. We all know about that in GP. But particularly trainees. So we're starting quite early in terms of reinforcing these attitudes. The importance around having resources to enable people to work remotely. So we need hardware, we need software, we need to break down the cultural barriers. So in terms of BMA priorities, we're looking at developing a definition of flexible working, working with doctors from different branches of practice, because this needs to work for everybody. And the BMA's Gender Pay Gap Working Group, calling for the promotion of flexible working and our work on recruitment and retention, particularly for female doctors, lobbying for greater support from employers for people who have childcare or dependent responsibilities, and guidance on flexible working for doctors experiencing menopause. And it's really important that we build on the lessons and the good points and the good things that we've learned from COVID-19 and how flexibility has been introduced at how we've been working, and so that the good areas of practice are perpetuated. There are some cons, and I think we need to be aware of that and mitigate against that. So the other thing is going on building on progress made on flexible training and addressing the disadvantages faced by less than full-time trainees, for example, accessing study leave, leadership opportunities and self-development, which when post-CCT, when you apply for jobs, can cause quite a stark difference between male and female trainees. Thank you.
Great point, Samira, thank you. I'd like to bring Amanda in now to hear her thoughts on flexible working and perhaps also bring some of the international perspective. Amanda.
Okay, thanks everybody. Yes, the work, first on the international perspective, the work I quoted earlier about what helped women to stay in the workforce and be committed and thrive with different situations was done internationally. It was done with a sample. You can read it in the journal. I'll put it in the chat in a minute, but I think it was surprisingly consistent that if people worked in a setting where they could access reliable childcare and their workplace culture was supportive of them for a period of their lives, doing that for, you know, the benefit of them, their family, society, they stayed in and they thrived and they didn't drop out and they progressed their careers. And in settings where that was difficult or it was seen as, you know, a weakness, then they ended up dropping out. One thing that struck me just in the last few minutes is, what is a flexible working career? So it might be that you're a full-time GP, but if you spend a day a week doing supervision of training and students and a day a week of leadership at the commissioning group, actually that's 2 days out of the practice, which might look very similar 5 years ago when you had young children, when you also took 2 days out of the practice, but it was for more personal reasons. And so I think the thing we said about if there's a positive attitude towards flexible working for certain purposes, whether it's professional or personal, that's a really good start. And if that attitude is not stigmatizing, but it's positive, that would be really important. One of the challenges, of course, with general practice, as Jane said at the beginning, is a bit different from the hospitals. We're a much more diverse situation. And people do therefore have to negotiate their own personal contract, personal working conditions, and it may be slightly harder than being able to compare yourself with the next SHO or the next registrar in a hospital. I'm not sure, but there may be something if we have transparency about pay and what you get for the work you're doing and the responsibilities you're helping. I think those sort of structural issues may help. And then the other thing I was thinking was the more we talk about feeling underconfident because I've had to take a bit of a career break, maybe the worse it gets. And I've seen at the same time some really good examples in practice of people who are, off for some reason or working less than they used to for some reason, still being included, still given a mentor, still given the opportunity, again, particularly online, like Samira is just saying, join the practice CPD event, join the team meeting. Why be excluded just because you're not here that day? Of course, if you can't do it because you've got children at home, don't do it, fine. But, I think where there's a will, there's a way. And maybe the real importance of the report is that it's triggering this conscious discussion again to get people to think about, the attitudinal solutions and the structural solutions, and whether we really value people, actually. I think that's what it comes down to. And that theme went on around the world. Does your workplace value you as a female GP to make the contribution you do to the profession, but also to society and to the other areas that you might be working in, whether that be academic, service development, or, clinical research? So that's my thought.
Thank you, Amanda. So another important part of the report, the Dacre report, was exploring the question of career progression and leadership opportunities. So we have asked at our poll, do you feel equipped and confident to have conversations about career progression, taking leadership roles and negotiating higher pay? Well, 78% of our respondents answered no to this question. Just 22% said that they felt quite confident or confident to do so. So let's hear from Jane now to hear a little bit more detail on what the report findings were and how do these manifest in general practice.
So one of the things that came out in the report was an issue about the culture of the way that pay progresses in the NHS. So the NHS was set up in 1948 and it really hasn't modernised its culture. It was set up for the careers of a man who perhaps was a GP or was a hospital doctor, who started at the bottom, who worked the way through the ranks, who went to work every day, who never took any time out, and who accrued a whole load of incremental pay increases. And then came the women, and the women are now 50% or more than 50% of doctors, and also certainly more than 50% of GPs. And they went in and out of this career trajectory. And what happened with them in doing that is that they got themselves on a slower progression up that seniority curve because of periods of time out for maternity, periods of part-time, and they've never caught up. So what we need to do is to make sure that women have the opportunity to have the same slope, the same steep career slope that men have. And at the moment they don't because of the way that they go through it. And that a lot of that is a cultural thing. So various things that would make women have less of a pay gap than men is becoming partners. And so opportunities and support for women to train, to be able to become leaders and to be able to become partners and take on those extra activities would reduce the pay gap. The pay gap in primary care is very big for salaried partners. So if there were training programs and support for women to encourage them to take on those extra roles in partnership, that would help. So the final thing I want to say about this is something that Carol has taught me, which is a lot of the problems in pay development are actually structural. And there's a wonderful lady feminist from Harvard called Iris Bonet. She's got a wonderful name as well. And what she says is, don't fix the people, fix the system. So we shouldn't be saying to women, come on, you need to be more like that 1950s male and then you'd earn more money. What we should be saying is that the GP system for training and going up the career ladder and developing seniority should be tailored around those people that are in the jobs, and remembering that more than 50% of the people in those jobs are women.
Thank you, Jane. I love this. Don't fix the people, fix the system. Caroline, what's your perspective from the academic world in terms of career progression?
Okay, thanks, Victoria. You've frozen. So I think I've already described this, but academics are judged on their performance, on their grant income, on their outputs in terms of publications. So anybody working less than full time, and already a clinical academic is working less than full time compared to a health service researcher, but less than full time clinical academics will be slower to progress. And as I've said, the fact that they're working less than full time is often overlooked in their appraisals and in their promotion opportunities. And the same applies, as I've said, to clinical excellence awards, where women are underrepresented.
Thank you. And going to Samira, what often comes up in conversations around this is the question of negotiating pay and learning to speak up for yourself. Having those conversations can be really challenging, as we know. And from your point of view, what's the most important thing for people to remember?
I think it's important in terms of, I know we don't fix the individual, but it is important to have that value in yourself, that confidence. We know that when men, for example, apply for a job, a senior job, they will not hit that 100% essential criteria, whereas women will feel that they have to before they take that step. So I think it's important that, yes, feeling that value and going for it, just going for it. And I think one of the things that the BMA has done is set up a network of elected women where actually there is that encouragement to go for things, and there are a set of resources, for example, negotiation, looking at pension, looking at how you can develop yourself so that you have that confidence. We have also, the other thing is about demystifying the partnership, demystifying these senior roles. Anybody can do them, but it's just taking that leap. So in terms of pieces of work, we are looking at producing some partnership guidance, which will break it down, and that will mean accessibility for everybody. There's also some guidance from 1996, and we're talking about it here, but women in GP, that we're looking to update back in 2020, now in 2021, so that it encourages women. But on the BMA website, there's information on negotiation, there's information on job planning, there are webinars, and it is just going for it. If you put yourself out there, you're more likely to do it, but there is that thing about that's holding it back, the system. So I think it is all of our problem, but there are issues that you as an individual and steps that you can take to address that too.
Thank you. And thinking of us as individuals, we've all heard about the imposter syndrome, or this lack of confidence that some women struggle with. It's more common in women, partly through the fact that we have to work within systems or workplaces that are quite inflexible, also not having access to the same sometimes professional networks as male colleagues might have, or facing assumptions, like we mentioned before, about our professional competence because we choose to work fewer hours. So Davina, what has been your experience so far as someone at the relatively start of their career?
So thanks, Victoria. So it's no surprise that workplace mentorship and support are important for female trainees. And just hearing, for example, Jane saying, don't fix the people, fix the system, is an inspirational quote that I'm just going to take forward and spread amongst the other GP trainees. These are things that we need. And in a series of interviews with 12 women in medical leadership conducted by the Royal College of Physicians, it was identified that role modeling, mentorship and support really does help resilience. And especially during training, this is so important. And regarding academia, the Athena Swan Charter also highlighted the absence of women from senior academic professional support roles. And this led to the lack of funding opportunities and really had a significant impact on gender parity. So as a trainee, I have seen multiple UK-based initiatives. There has been the Royal College of Physicians Women in Medicine project showcasing the influential women clinicians. There's been the Women's Leadership Network masterclasses and workshops, and these are all well received by those able to access them. But what I feel is these initiatives need to really be coupled with the identification of these structural barriers hindering the achievement of gender equity in the workplace. And we must not forget men. They have a key role to play in promoting these opportunities for women. And a range of engagement initiatives should be considered to encourage men to critically reflect on gender inequalities and work towards supporting women in these challenging discrimination and institutions. So it's really important to address both males and females' own behaviour and attitudes, and driving this really forward, starting from medical school, through training, through when you're working fully and as a GP as well. And there has been, like, the World Medical Association and the General Medical Council have highlighted this in their reports about modernising medical training and careers, but we must ensure that we continue this emphasis on these workshops and continue it.
Thank you. So Amanda, what are your thoughts about what the college may be able to do in order to help women throughout their career stages to seek out role models and to be more confident and to advocate for themselves?
I think perhaps the first thing is being included in networks. So one thing we just heard, you know, and I remember very vividly from my own, when I was at Davina's stage, that my local faculty included people like me, men and women, invited us to events, and there you could get advice or just discussion with senior colleagues, really, and you felt valued as part of that network or that family. So again, I agree, it's not about fixing people, but it's about showing them support, an opportunity and identity. And that's one thing that the college, you know, as a network, whether in your local faculty or if you join a special interest group or whatever, gives you another sphere for building your experience, almost regardless of what your working situation is, it's still there for you. And then we have actually enhanced that with quite recently with having an RCGP mentorship platform, which members can register on and join. And again, I agree with Davina just said about men being allies too. And in my working lifetime, I've certainly had a few male colleagues who, you know, really, really helped me by giving me new opportunities and making me think about new things I could do and didn't denigrate the stage that I was at for whatever reason. So I think we've talked quite a lot about allyship in, you know, for racial justice as well. And I think that that concept's really important. And then I think, as I said earlier, educate. So, you know, learning the skills of advocacy, learning how to do it skillfully, playing around with it a bit so that when you've got your material from the BMA website, you know actually a little bit about how advocacy works and how change can work. And I think the college is, you know, good at education as well as the support side. And hopefully somewhere in the college, you'll find people you can reach out to and ask specific questions about. At the same time, the other thing the college offers is that much higher level systems partnership, you know, systems advocacy, again, working with SAPC, working with the academy, working with GPC to try and, you know, push change at the system level, because it isn't enough that an individual has to do it for themselves. So that's just a few thoughts, Victoria, thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So thinking of next steps, what should these be? I will come to Jane first. Jane, please.
Thank you. So Amanda, just a thought. One of the things that we've run at the Royal College of Physicians and also the College of Surgeons have done it, and I've done it at UCL, is what we call the Emerging Women Leaders Programme. Very happy to talk to anybody from your college offline about that, because it's worked very well. It's a mixture of role modelling, mentoring and leadership theory that might be helpful to talk to your college about. So yeah, okay, what happens next? Well, the report that we wrote based on Carol's research came up with 7 themes for recommendations, and within those 7 themes there are 42 different recommendations. And just to sort of whistle through the themes, a number of which have come up today. The first is about making senior jobs accessible and attractive to women. The second is address the system's barriers to progression. We've talked about both of those. The third is to increase transparency. Who in this panel knows what their male colleagues earn? Who understands how pay works in general practice? It took Carol's brain plus some of her friends to work out how it works. It's really difficult to see how GP pay setting is done. There are some things that should be mandatory. There's a lot of change in HR law that's kind of nudge, but we need to be a bit tougher about what we suggest that people do. So make some mandatory changes. Address the behavioural and cultural challenges that there are for women in the workplace. Get rid of what we call the Miss Trigg syndrome. That's that Punch cartoon that says, that's a wonderful idea, Miss Trigg. Perhaps one of the men would like to suggest it. So get rid of those kinds of cultural and behavioural issues. Look at clinical excellence awards to try and level up the playing field there. And then the final recommendation is look at this some more, do some more research on it, find out what is causing that the bit section of the pay gap in primary care that nobody knows what it is. Is it discrimination? Is it explainable? Get people to do some research on looking at all of that. So that's the recommendations. Now they ran the risk of sitting on a dusty shelf because of COVID and because of Brexit and because we keep swapping prime ministers and doing goodness knows what, and because there's now no money. And so Carol and I have had to become quite vociferous in pushing to get the department to do something. And I'm really pleased to say that actually just earlier today, I've heard that they are going to, the implementation group is going to be set up before the beginning. So around the time of the summer recess and before the next session of Parliament begins. And one of the things that's really positive about this report is the support that we've had from stakeholder organisations. And a huge number of them are already starting to do these things already. So what we'll do in the implementation group is pull all of that work together and work with the Department of Health to have a longer term plan to just make sure that we nail all of those recommendations and get them all done and make sure that they're done properly and that they make a difference to the pay gap, whilst getting a group like Carol's group to measure how much of a difference we're making. So that's the plan.
Thank you. Carol, research and measuring impact. Any comments from you on this, please?
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah, I'd like to pick up on something that Jane touched on there, which is that the heart of this issue for me lies in the structures, the pay structures. And there's such a difference between GPs' pay structures and those of the hospital and trust medicine doctors, in that they are almost unrecognisable one with the other. What we have to remember is that GP practices are in themselves small businesses, and they are able to set pay according to their needs, and they're able to, or they have to respond to the market. So it's very much more variable than it is within the hospital and trust sector, where pay scales are transparent. They're not perfect, as Jane pointed out. They're far too long, so that women take 20 years or so to catch up on lost time. But at least they're transparent. In the GP sector, there isn't any transparency, and it is women that are losing out consistently and time again. And I wouldn't blame them. For my purposes, I would blame the system, and I would say there needs to be more guidance, there needs to be more structure, there needs to be a national rate, if possible, on pay determination, so that we don't have this situation where it's up to the individual to create their own set of circumstances over hours and pay, etc. They will continue to lose out that way. So that's the change I'd like to see.
Great, thank you. So if there was one action that we would like the RCGP to take, what would that be? We asked this question on our poll, and the results are, in terms of events and networks, 0%, mentorship and role models, 20%, boards, councils and committees representation, 20%, and recognition and sponsorship for women leaders, 60%. So it seems like quite a lot of our audience is keen on sponsorship and mentorship opportunities. What are your thoughts, Caroline? What are your thoughts on the results?
Okay, so I'm surprised that people don't want events and networks. So I hope that doesn't mean that we've got no audience tonight. Yeah, that's interesting, and I think the mentorship and role modelling and the sponsorship is really important. And I suppose here I want to mention the work that the Society for Academic Primary Care is doing. So we have an EDI initiative going on at the moment. The executive is predominantly female, so I think we're offering some role models there. We offer the opportunity for networking both at conferences but also our special interest groups. We offer informal support and we offer mentoring. So I would certainly say to any clinical academics on this event, please do look at the SAPSI website, look at opportunities for mentoring, because I think actually that is the support that you need. It helps you get over the imposter syndrome. It helps you ask and negotiate pay, both as a GP but also with your university, because whilst universities are on the whole transparent about appointments and about pay, I think there's still some negotiation that goes on. I think some men are better at having those negotiations than women are when appointed to senior positions. So I think my advert is for what SAPS is doing for the clinical academics of the future.
Right, thank you. Davina?
The survey was interesting, and specifically having recognition for these women leaders, because as a trainee I can look up and say, yes, it is possible to be on an NHS leader board, or it's possible to be on the RCGP council. There's females there, or even mentors who will mentor me in negotiation skills or to get to a partner level in a GP practice and really show that this is achievable things. And I want the RCGP to continue the support they have been providing with trainees in terms of developing this mentorship platform, which is great, which is a new initiative, or even the RCGP conference where they allow mothers to breastfeed their babies in between the lectures. I think that's fantastic, and I haven't seen any other college do that. So if we continue these amazing initiatives for females, I think it's great for these younger trainees coming through.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we have a little bit of time for one or two extra questions from our audience. And the first one is, should information on the gender pay gap be transparent? How could I find out about where I work, how much other people are getting paid? So can I bring Samira here, please?
Thank you very much. Some people do know what their colleagues get paid. I think one of the first questions is perhaps destigmatizing talking about money. Sometimes we think that's not the right thing. Well, actually, it is. You are exchanging your time for money. So it's something, getting over that fear. But yes, the gender pay gap, it's not published. There is some work from GPC England looking at how best to do that in a way that is useful, because we know that numbers don't always tell the story, and it's really important that that's done in the right way, that it will be best used. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that as GPs and as practices, we work within an ecosystem. There's an intersectional element of this. We know that there's huge disparities between how practices may work and the environments in which they are operating in and the pressures that they are exposed to. So we'd be really keen for a system solution, acknowledging, for example, access to maternity, parental leave, occupational health, to keep people in. This starts when people are in their 30s. It doesn't start when they're post-CCT and they're qualified. That's a really important. So as a trainee, you're often under a lead employer in England. I know this is a potentially for nation, but as you are under a lead employer. So I think recognising that general practice is not always treated the same as other parts of the NHS. I think that's a fundamental question in terms of resource and attitude from the whole system. And I think that would really help support and enable practices and GPs to, institute measures that would help reduce the gender pay gap.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The second question is on intersectionality. So the question is, are people of color or BAME heritage more adversely affected by the differences in pay? And if so, do we know what the percentage is, or is there any research going on this issue? Can I ask the authors of the report, maybe they have some thoughts on this? Have you looked into this, or do you know whether this is going to be looked into in the future?
Shall I take that one?
Yes, please, Carol. I think Jane.
I was going to say yes, hand it over to Carol.
Thank you so much. Yes, there's a lot of work. We are fortunate enough to have continuing permission from the Department of Health and Social Care to carry out research on the medical profession. And one of the pieces that's currently under review is an analysis of pay by ethnicity and gender. So looking at the intertwining forces of ethnicity and gender together, and no surprise, yes, ethnicity is a factor in pay. It does tend to diminish your pay for women in particular. But that's done on the hospital and trust sector, because the GP analysis does not include race. So the data is very weak on ethnicity for GPs. So one of our recommendations in the review is to improve the data, because we can't monitor what we can't measure. So very much that's important. But yes, we're continuing the work, and there will be work trickling through as we send it for publication, and hopefully are successful, on the ethnic dimensions of all of these factors: progression, seniority, and pay.
Great, thank you. And Davina, you want to come in, please?
Yes, I wanted to mention Kimberly Crenshaw, because she initially coined this term, intersectional feminism, back in 1989. And she said, we tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. But some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its individual parts. And we have the RES. The RES is now required of NHS commissioners and providers through the NHS standard contract. And it really focuses on enabling people to work comfortably with race equality and change these deep-rooted cultures of inequality. So I just wanted to highlight Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989.
Thank you, Davina. And of course, the issue of data comes in again and again on this as well. So we are coming towards the end of our time now. So I would like to invite Amanda to wrap up and reflect on this very fascinating conversation. And it's only the beginning of the conversation. So Amanda, over to you.
Oh, thank you. One comment I just saw coming from a colleague saying, so I want to know how equitable I'm being in my practice and how can I do more? And I think that's a really nice place to start, because hopefully everybody who's listened to this, read the report, or may listen later, will reflect on what else they could do to improve this. And I think the usual way to think about it, that is sort of micro, meso, macro. So what can I do as an individual in my place to raise awareness, perhaps look again at the pay rates and check that everybody's getting paid equally for equal pay rate, equal work, and make that transparent or explicit, so that in a sense the colleagues don't even have to start talking. I think everybody go in tomorrow and check that out, but also then participate at the more system level about, what needs to change and what's happening in your locality or indeed nationally. And as I said earlier, that I'm sure that the college will be having these conversations through the academy with GPC, and that's really important. I think that I'd encourage our members, certainly, particularly, the younger ones, the AIT committee, the first 5 era, to be having those conversations too, and senior leaders like Victoria and Carolyn and I, supporting those conversations, leadership workshops, advocacy training. Again, some of that educational stuff helps people to feel more empowered when they're having difficult conversations, and they become more skillful about how to do that in the process. So I think continuing to provide those things that build confidence and competence over time. And I've mentioned the mentorship platform. The other thing that's just run through my mind, Victoria, is, of course, one of the things that sometimes helped me to be resilient is to know that, you have to keep going. And if you go to our, we've launched an exhibition this week called Women at the Heart of General Practice. And it's online. You can find the link on the college website. And what we learn is, women have had to fight a lot of battles and meet a lot of challenges in medicine for a very long time. And to be resilient, you have to feel confident that you can make a difference, confident. You have to collaborate with people, find the people who can help you to make a difference, keep calm, don't bang your head too often on the brick wall because it hurts, but find ways around it. And also, understand that sometimes things take a while to happen. And I think certainly when I was looking at the Women in General Practice exhibition as it was launched, I was thinking, yep, people have been here before and they'll be here again, but providing we keep going, things change. And so I think that's the other thought that I would like to have to encourage our members to, it's great. Thank you to Jane and Carol and the others who've done this work. Thank you for people like Carolyn who, keep championing it in medical school sector and the university sector. Thanks to Victoria so much for convening the webinar and making it happen. And thanks to Samira and Davina for being so inspirational at their early stage, because they are role models too. So that's, I think, as much as I would like to sum up. I don't know whether other colleagues want to make any final comments.
I cannot see any hands up. Thank you again to our fantastic panel for this really thought-provoking conversation. It will be available shortly afterwards on YouTube. Please keep talking to us, share your thoughts, share your suggestions. Share the report with your colleagues and let's keep going with this conversation in order to affect change. We have a lot of work to do. Thanks again and good evening.